The Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle.
Read and presented by George Pitropogiannakis.
Book 3, Chapter 7. Now since the end is the object of wish, and the means to the end of deliberation and moral choice, the actions regarding these matters must be in the way of moral choice, that is voluntary. But the acts of working out the virtues are such actions, and therefore virtue is in our power, and so too is vice, because wherever it is in our power to do it is also in our power to forbear doing, and vice versa. Therefore, if the doing, being in a given case creditable, is in our power, so too is the forbearing, which is in the same case discreditable, and vice versa. But if it is in our power to do and to forbear doing what is creditable, or the contrary, and these respectively constitute the being good or bad, then the being good or vicious characters is in our power. As for the well-known saying, no man voluntarily is wicked or involuntarily happy, it is partly true, partly false. For no man is happy against his will, of course, but wickedness is voluntary, or must. We dispute the statements lately made, and not say that man is the originator or generator of his actions as much as of his children. But if this is matter of plain manifest fact, and we cannot refer our actions to any other originations beside those in our own power, those things must be in our own power, and so voluntary, the originations of which are in ourselves. Moreover, testimony seems to be borne to these positions both privately by individuals and by lawgivers too, in that they chastise and punish those who do wrong, unless they do so on compulsion or by reason of ignorance which is not self-caused, while they honor those who act rightly under the notion of being likely to encourage the latter and restrain the former. But such things as are not in our own power, that is not voluntary, no one thinks of encouraging us to do, knowing it to be of no avail for one to have been persuaded not to be hot, for instance, or feel pain, or be hungry, and so forth, because we shall have those sensations all the same. And what makes the case stronger is this, that they chastise for the very fact of ignorance, when it is thought to be self-caused. To the drunken, for instance, penalties are double, because the origination in such case lies in a man's own self, for he might have helped getting drunk, and this is the cause of his ignorance. Again, those also who are ignorant of legal regulations, which they are bound to know, and which are not hard to know, they chastise. And similarly, in all other cases, where neglect is thought to be the cause of the ignorance, under the notion that it was in their power to prevent their ignorance, because they might have paid attention. But perhaps a man is of such a character that he cannot attend to such things. Still, men are themselves the causes of having become such characters by living carelessly, and also of being unjust or destitute of self-control, the former by doing evil actions, the latter by spending their time in drinking and such like, because the particular acts of working form corresponding characters, as is shown by those who are practicing for any contest or particular course of action. For such men persevere in the acts of working. As for the plea that a man did not know that habits are produced from separate acts of working, we reply, such ignorance is a mark of excessive stupidity. Furthermore, it is wholly irrelevant to say that the man who acts unjustly or dissolutely does not wish to attain the habits of these vices. For if a man wittingly does those things whereby he must become unjust, he is, to all intents and purposes, unjust voluntarily, but he cannot with a wish cease to be unjust and become just. For, to take the analogous case, the sick man cannot with a wish be well again. Yet, in a supposable case, he is voluntarily ill because he has produced his sickness by living intemperately and disregarding his physicians. There was a time then when he might have helped being ill, but now he has let himself go, he cannot any longer, just as he who has let a stone out of his hand cannot recall it, and yet it rested with him to aim and throw it, because the origination was in his power. Just so the unjust man and he who has lost all self-control might originally have helped, being what they are, and so they are voluntarily what they are. But now that they are become so, they no longer have the power of being otherwise. And not only are mental diseases voluntary, but the bodily are so in some men, whom we accordingly blame, for such as are naturally deformed. No one blames only such as are, so by reason of want of exercise and neglect, and so too of weakness and maiming. No one would think of upbraiding, but would rather compassionate a man who is blind by nature or from disease or from an accident, but everyone would blame him who was so from excess of wine or any other kind of intemperance. It seems then that in respect of bodily diseases, those which depend on ourselves are censured, those which do not are not censured. And if so, then, in the case of the mental disorders, those which are censured must depend upon ourselves. But suppose a man to say that by our own admission all men aim at, that which conveys to their minds an impression of good, and that men have no control over this impression, but that the end impresses each with a notion correspondent to his own individual character. That to be sure, if each man is in a way the cause of his own moral state, so he will be also of the kind of impression he receives. Whereas, if this is not so, no one is the cause to himself of doing evil actions, but he does them by reason of ignorance of the true end, supposing that through their means he will secure the chief good. Further, that this aiming at the end is no matter of one's own choice, but one must be born with a power of mental vision, so to speak, whereby to judge fairly and choose that which is really good. And he is blessed by nature, who has this naturally well, because it is the most important thing and the fairest, and what a man cannot get or learn from another, but will have such as nature has given it. And for this to be so given well and fairly would be excellence of nature in the highest and truest sense. If all this be true, how will virtue be a whit more voluntary than vice? Alike to the good man and the bad, the end gives its impression, and is fixed by nature, or howsoever you like to say, and they act so, and so, referring everything else to this end. Whether then we suppose that the end impresses each man's mind with certain notions, not merely by nature, but that there is somewhat also dependent on himself, or that the end is given by nature. And yet virtue is voluntary, because the good man does all the rest voluntarily. Vice must be equally so, because his own agency equally attaches to the bad man in the actions, even if not in the selection of the end. If then, as is commonly said, the virtues are voluntary, because we at least cooperate in producing our moral states, and we assume the end to be of a certain kind according as we are ourselves of certain characters. The vices must be voluntary also, because the cases are exactly similar.